Great. Thank you very much, Tony, for that wonderful introduction and all the housekeeping for everyone that's participating. This set of presentations and panel discussion is being sponsored by the IARPC, which is the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, which brings together leaders from 18 agencies and departments and offices across the U.S. and the federal government and regional communities. So I thank everyone for taking the time out of their day to listen and to participate in this discussion, because I think this is kind of an interesting one. It's going to be an exciting one. And it's being sponsored by the Marine Ecosystems Community of Practice, which is co-led by myself and Daniel Dixon with the North Pacific Research Board, who's online, as well as Jackie Grebmeyer, who's also online and is with the University of Maryland. The Marine Ecosystems Community of Practice really focuses on increasing our understanding of the structure and function of Arctic marine ecosystems and their role in kind of the climate system and advancing predictive capabilities. So with this specific series of talks, how this all came about is that I think that this is probably very familiar to everyone that's attending today, that a number of models came out, well over a decade ago, that talked about the theory and kind of conceptualization of climate change and borealization of marine stocks. This basic idea that over time we are going to steadily get incrementally warmer, and we will see more temperate stocks kind of incrementally move north. But we've all lived a very different Arctic environment in the last, say, decade, where we've seen wild swings in temperature due to heat waves and other phenomena that has led to large migrations or discrepancies in population structure throughout the region. And it really brought up the question of going, are we really seeing borealization? Are we seeing this kind of steady march north of species? Or are we seeing other phenomena that are starting to drive essentially marine ecosystem function in the Arctic? And so we asked for these three really, really great speakers to talk about different parts of the marine ecosystem and just exactly what we're seeing from empirical surveys and empirical data about this kind of theory of borealization and the northward progression with climate change of, say, fishes and zooplankton and even marine mammals. So I really want to thank and welcome Libby Lagerwell, Dwayne Stevenson, and Catherine Birchak for taking time out of their day to present to us. I think what we're hoping to do here is have each of them give a brief presentation and then try to do our best to hold questions to the end so that we can have a kind of a very comprehensive discussion about this topic with our three wonderful speakers. So if there's nothing pressing right off the top, I think it'd be great to get started. Okay, after the kind of the always awkward pause to make sure there's nothing big going on. Libby, are you good with being our first speaker?
I sure am. Thank you. And thank you, Lyle and Tony, for organizing this seminar. I will share my screen. Okay. So my name is Libby Lagerwell from the EcoFoci program at NOAA, Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And today I'm going to talk about ecosystem restructuring in the northern Bering and Chukchi Seas. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors. For this particular presentation, I worked with Silvana Gonzalez, Yvonne Ortiz, and Kim Rand, but also listed here are the key PIs in the synthesis project that I'll be talking about. So this work is part of the North Pacific Research Board's Arctic program, Arctic Integrated Ecosystem Research Program synthesis phase. We also have support from NOAA Arctic Research Program and Fisheries. And the red box shows our study area in the northern Bering and Chukchi Seas. So this project was actually not designed to study borealization. Our central hypothesis had to do with pelagic benthic coupling. And this conceptual model shown here, this is what we think, how we think the Arctic was structured before 2 decades of ocean warming and loss of sea ice, where you can see in the top are pelagic modules, phytoplankton feeding zooplankton, which then feeds pelagic forage fish and pelagic foraging marine birds and mammals. But a key factor in Arctic ecosystems is also a strong flux of phytoplankton production to the benthos, supporting a rich benthic infauna and epifauna, which in turn supports benthic adult fish and crab and benthic foraging marine birds and mammals. The hypothesis is, though, that with warming and loss of sea ice, there's been a reduction in this flux from the pelagic to the benthos, resulting in more stuff, biomass production in the pelagic and less in the benthic. So that was our key hypothesis, is that this pelagic to benthic coupling has weakened over the past 20 years. Here are the data that we have to look at this hypothesis. So we have our 2 regions we looked at separately, Northern Bering, Chukchi Sea. And of all the thousands of taxa measured, we picked these focal taxa in the phytoplankton, zooplankton, pelagic fish and jellyfish, epibenthic fish, epibenthic invertebrates, and infauna. And these are species that had either a potential economic significance, a key ecological role, or human subsistence importance. On the right, you can see the number of samples in each region divided up by these groups of taxa from 2002 to 2020 or 22 here in the Northern Bering Sea. So this to me is very exciting to see all these data together in one place. And it's been really amazing to analyze these data. So the first step was for the postdoc, Silvana Gonzalez, took those raw catch data and using the vector autoregressive spatiotemporal package of Jim Thorson, created these lovely time series of estimated biomass. So that alone, I think, is a really amazing result from this work, to have all these data synthesized in this way. So how do we look at these with regard to this pelagic to benthic coupling hypothesis? So very simply, I worked with Yvonne Ortiz to look at the trend. And if you look on the lower left, you can see how we did this. So if there was an increase by 1 or more standard deviations over this 20-year time window, you get an up arrow. If there's a decrease, you get a down arrow. And if the change was less than 1 standard deviation, we get the side-to-side arrow. And then I simply divided the different taxa into whether they were benthic or pelagic and looked to see what the trend has been over the past 20 years. So on the left are benthic taxa, the infauna, benthic inverts, and benthic fish. And on the right are pelagic fauna, the zooplankton, jellyfish, and pelagic fish. And my expectation was that if there has been a breakdown in pelagic benthic coupling, I would expect to see an increase in all the pelagic taxa and a decrease in all the benthic taxa. Super simple approach. And that is not what we see. Some benthic taxa have been on the increase, some have been on the decrease, some haven't changed at all. And in the pelagic, if anything, the majority seem to have just sort of stayed the same over the past 20 years. This is for the Chukchi Sea. Same data set up for the Northern Bering Sea. And similarly, don't see a strong indication of the benthic taxa on the decline and the pelagic taxa on the incline as a whole. But there is an alternative hypothesis, which we're here to think about today, of borealization. I won't show you this slide because you all know what borealization is. So now I have compared the trends of taxa, what defined by either them being a boreal species or an Arctic species, and as defined by Litzow, Mutter, and colleagues in these two papers. And now we see a little bit more striking pattern. Most of our boreal taxa have been on the increase over the past 20 years. And the Arctic taxa are either on the decrease or just hanging tight, staying steady. To me, this is consistent with borealization. What about the northern Bering Sea? Same situation, our boreal taxa on the left, Arctic taxa on the right, and nearly all of the boreal taxa in the northern Bering Sea have increased over the past 20 years, whereas the Arctic taxa have either been on the decline or stayed about the same. So that's exciting. What's next? So conclusions and next steps. This analysis of the 20-year trends in pelagic and benthic coupling in the northern Bering and Chukchi Sea did not support our hypothesis of weakened pelagic to benthic coupling, but did support borealization. This is a first look at this idea. Our next steps are Silvana Gonzalez is going to do, in the process of doing, some empirical orthogonal function analysis to get deeper into the spatial and temporal changes and also the environmental drivers. Mathieu Veron, our second postdoc, is working with Jim Thorson to do dynamic structural equation modeling to more formally identify and quantify these links between ecosystem components and taxa. And then Yvonne Ortiz and I are going to produce a NOAA ecosystem status report card update for all these time series. This will go first to our North Pacific Fishery Management Council and then out to the public somehow. A lot of this work, hopefully most of it, will be published in a special issue of Deep Sea Research, title shown here, that NPRB is managing. Matt Baker, who may or may not be on the line, is organizing that. So stay tuned. That's all I have for now. I'd be happy to entertain any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby. I saw a version of this talk a while back when you were mainly looking at the pelagic and benthic coupling, and seeing it reordered towards this kind of concept of borealization really changes the outcomes of the results. Just very quickly before we move on to Dwayne, I want to make sure there isn't like anybody that has a question that can't wait until the end. Okay, so for expediency, Dwayne Stevenson, are you ready to go?
I believe I'm ready, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Let's try to share my screen here. Success, can we see it?
We see it.
All right, great. Well, thanks to Lyle and thanks to IARPIC for the invite today. My name is Dwayne Stevenson, and I am also at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. I'm with the Groundfish Assessment Program, and I lead our Bering Sea Bottom Trawl Survey Group. The main reason that we exist as a scientific group is to conduct bottom trawl surveys, primarily in the Eastern Bering Sea. We have conducted primarily 2 bottom trawl surveys over the last almost 50 years. The first is the EBS survey, what we call the Eastern Bering Sea Bottom Trawl Survey, which you see in the southern part of the map there. And that includes approximately 376 stations, and we have done that every year since 1982, with the exception of 2020. And so that's where most of our data comes from. That's a great long-term data set that we get a lot of use out of. More recently, we have started surveying the northern Bering Sea as well, and that's the area on the map that's outlined in black. That's a survey area that consists of 144 stations, and we have done that 6 times over the past about the past 15 years. The first time we conducted that survey was in 2010 during a relatively cold year, and then we weren't able to do the survey again until 2017 which was a warm year. And then we have done that survey for 5 years since 2017, all relatively warm years. So I'm primarily going to talk about data from the years in which we have done both the EBS and NBS surveys. So we have a synoptic look at the entire eastern and northern Bering Sea survey area. Just to give you some context about what kind of survey we're talking about here, our survey platforms are chartered commercial fishing vessels, primarily pollock vessels, and the approximately 150-foot long range. Our net is what's called the 83-112 otter trawl. It has a net opening of approximately 50 feet or 15 meters wide and an approximate height of 2 meters. And we tow this net for 30 minutes at a time, covering approximately 1.5 kilometers of bottom distance for each tow. So I take it everyone in this audience knows a little bit about what borealization is here, so I won't go into this too much, except to say that basically the reason that the Bering Sea ecosystem is so important here is that we expect that somewhere in the Bering Sea there will be a transition from what we consider a boreal marine community, which has the characteristics that you see on the left there, to an Arctic marine community. And the interesting part is, where does that transition happen, and is that transition zone moving? And in order to look at that transition zone, we can look at things like ice cover. We can look at things like a lot of things that Libby talked about, like the food chain, pelagic consumers versus benthic consumers, benthopelagic coupling. And then for our data from the data that we get from the bottom trawl survey, we can look at things like, how do we characterize the biomass? Is that biomass consisting of primarily fishes or primarily of invertebrates? Or is it dominated by large gaddids and flatfishes, or is it dominated by more Arctic species, which tend to be smaller in body size and are of slightly different taxonomic composition? And so those are the questions that I want to sort of briefly address in the next few slides. In terms of the overall thermal history as context, every time we put a trawl in the water, we measure the temperature both on the bottom and at the surface. And then we take the average of all of those temperatures over an entire survey year to come up with the figure that you see on the upper right there. So we have a mean annual bottom temperature and a mean annual surface temperature for each year that we do a survey. This happens to be just from the Eastern Bering Sea survey because that gives us the longest time series. And one of the things that you can notice most prominently from this, the figure on the upper right here, and many of you are probably aware of this already, is that back in the 1980s and 90s, we saw a trend of sort of a warm year and cold year, somewhat alternating, and a relatively low magnitude change from interannually. What we had seen more recently, particularly since the year 2000, is a series of what have been termed stanzas of relatively warm temperatures. So in the early 2000s, a few relatively warm years strung together, and then a number of relatively cold years in series. And then lately, we've seen a lot of warm years in a row, culminating with the last 2 years, which have been sort of relatively neutral in terms of the overall bottom temperature. One of the things that we use those temperature data to do is to calculate the area of what we call the Bering Sea cold pool, which is the area of the Bering Sea shelf survey area that is 2 degrees C or less. And you can see how that cold pool area changes over time. In the relatively cool years, that cold pool may cover up to 60 or 70% of the Bering Sea shelf area that we're covering. And in the really, really warm years, particularly like 2018 and 2019, there's relatively little cold pool on the Bering Sea shelf. And if you look at that spatially, what that looks like, the relatively cold years primarily are on the left here. And there you can see that big sort of dark blue and black mass of water, which is the cold pool. And that's an area of really cold water that's left on the bottom after the seasonal sea ice melts out of the Bering Sea. And in the cold years, that cold pool extends way down in the northern, from the northern Bering Sea into the eastern Bering Sea, and sometimes almost all the way down to the Alaska Peninsula. In more recent history, in the warmer years, that cold pool has been relatively small, or in some cases, like particularly 2018 and 2019, almost non-existent, at least in the Eastern Bering Sea survey area. And we feel like that's important because that mass of cold water can act as a barrier to migration to north, from south to northward migration of some species during the summertime. So we expect to see, we know that some species of fish avoid that cold water, and we expect that cold pool to act as a barrier for migration. So is that what we're seeing? Do we see barriers to migration? What does it look like in terms of the overall distribution of fishes over this time in which we have surveyed both the northern and the eastern Bering Sea survey area? So here you have on the left distribution of walleye pollock, and on the right distribution of Pacific cod. And these are the overall distribution maps for populations that we surveyed in the 6 years in which we've done both the northern and the eastern Bering Sea survey area. So you'll see in 2010, which was again the cold year in which we conducted both of these surveys. In that northern Bering Sea survey area, there's relatively little concentration of these large gadids. So both pollock and cod have relatively low distribution in the northern Bering Sea survey area. That is, you don't see any of those dark blue concentrations of fish up there in 2010. But as we move into 2017 and 2019 in particular, those first warm years that we surveyed both areas, you see a major change in the distribution in the northern Bering Sea. We see big concentrations of Pacific cod and also walleye pollock, even to the north of St. Lawrence Island, between St. Lawrence Island and Bering Sea, in the Bering Strait. So again, those were years in which there was very little cold pool, so very little barrier to migration northward in the Bering Sea, and correlated with that, we see large populations of cod and pollock both in the northern Bering Sea. However, in recent years, when the temperatures have moderated more, we have seen sort of a change back to a distribution pattern more like what we saw in 2010, the cold water distribution pattern. So those species in the past 3 survey years have been primarily, very few large aggregations north of St. Lawrence Island to the Bering Strait. And in the Bering Sea survey, northern Bering Sea survey area in general, less populations, less concentrations of both cod and pollock outside of that eastern Bering Sea survey area. So our conclusion from that has been that the distribution of large gadids does show high interannual variability and can change relatively drastically on an interannual basis based on the temperature regime. I don't have any data shown on it, but we also have some satellite tagging data from Pacific cod that indicates that some of the specimens that we see in the northern Bering Sea in the summertime, during the spawning season in the winter, they may have migrated as far south as the Gulf of Alaska. So we know that these large gadids, these large sort of benthopelagic consumers, do travel large distances seasonally and can move significantly in response to the local temperature pattern. In contrast, there are a number of species that we survey in this area that are less mobile, that don't have the swimming capabilities, and the distributional shift capabilities that cod and pollock have. And particularly the Arctic species that we sort of think of as cold pool species that are generally highly correlated with the distribution of that colder water. So I have your Arctic cod on the left and a shorthorn sculpin on the right. These are 2 species that we know have traditionally been associated with really cold water. In particular, Arctic cod are associated heavily with sea ice. And for these 2 species, you can see that in 2010, we had significant, obviously these 2 species are more northerly distributed than the previous 2 that I showed. And we can see that they're widely distributed in the eastern Bering Sea as well as the northern Bering Sea in 2010. But starting in 2017 and moving all the way through to 2023, we have seen incremental restrictions of the distribution of both of these 2 species. So in effect, it looks like what's happening is they're disappearing from the eastern Bering Sea, and sort of the ranges look like they're shrinking back into the northern Bering Sea and even becoming less common in the northern Bering Sea as we move forward in time. In particular, we used to see, I've been doing this survey since the early 2000s, and we used to see hundreds of Arctic cod in the eastern Bering Sea. And lately, it's rare for us to see any Arctic cod in the eastern Bering Sea at all. And the same with shorthorn sculpin. I mean, it looks like there's a relatively consistent decline in the populations of these shorthorn sculpins in the Bering Sea as a whole over the last decade or so. And so our conclusion from this is that the distribution of these less mobile cold pool species may be slower to respond, but maybe less less likely to recover over the short term. And so this is one way to look at these things as individual species one by one, but we can also integrate all of these species together and sort of come up with these simple-minded ways to look at what the entire population is doing. If we think about a boreal versus an Arctic marine ecosystem, we should see in a boreal ecosystem a lot of these large benthic or benthopelagic consumers, cod and pollock. So we should see a lot of fish biomass. As we move into an Arctic ecosystem, we should see more invertebrate, more benthic invertebrate or bottom-associated biomass. And indeed, if we look at our survey data and just calculate the ratio of fish to invert biomass for each toe, and then plot that versus latitude, what we should see is a declining ratio. We should see a lot more fish biomass in the south and a lot more invertebrate biomass in the north. And if you look at this upper graph in the upper left, you'll see that 2010 year, the dashed black line there, we saw exactly that. We saw in our southern trawls, we saw almost all fish biomass. In our northern trawls, almost all invertebrate biomass. And so when we started trawling again in the north in 2017, we wanted to look at how that changed over time. And in fact, you'll see that yellow line, which represents 2017, shows a much smaller difference between the south and the north. A lot more fish biomass in the north than there was in 2010. So how did that change later on? If we look at 2019 and 2021, 19 was the warmest year and 21 was a little bit cooler again. We see kind of what we would expect to see. 2019 was similar in shape as far as this curve goes to 2017. Lots of fishes in the north. And then in 2021, there were fewer. 2021, particularly when you get closer to the Bering Strait in the far north, looks a lot more similar to 2010, where there were a lot more invertebrates. And then 2022 and 2023, which are the most recent years, you see here in the black and orange lines, look a lot more similar to 2010 than they do to the warm years. And so basically, we're looking at two things here. We're looking at basically the difference between the southern, the fish invert biomass ratio in the southern part of the survey area versus in the northern part of the survey area. And then you also see this this hump in the middle, this localized maximum around 59 to 61 degrees latitude. And that primarily represents that cod and pollock biomass, that heavy dose of fish biomass that we're seeing in those latitudes. And you'll see that whether or not we have a warmer versus cold year sort of determines or is correlated with where that hump is associated. And if you look at that versus with the spatial map in mind, you'll see that that hump in the middle during cold years is right around that 59 degrees latitude mark. So somewhere between the Pribilofs and the St. Matthew Island. Whereas when we have the warmer years, that hump shifts. So those populations shift north and are centered on St. Matthew Island or maybe a little further north than that. Okay, the last thing that I want to touch on is the engagement we've had with the native communities of the Bering Strait region. Since we started sampling the northern Bering Sea survey area over the past 10 years or so, we have put a lot of time and effort into engaging with the northern Bering Sea and the Bering Strait communities, and that's been really rewarding, I think, from both sides of the equation. We've created tools that allow the local communities to know exactly where we are and giving them real-time survey maps to update them on a daily basis. We have presented results to them and been very fortunate to get a lot of feedback in terms of what results they're interested in, what parts of the survey information they would like to hear and be updated on. We also prepare specific reports of highlights that are geared towards specifically the taxa and the aspects of the community that the native communities are interested in. So that's been a very rewarding part of this whole process, and has been really, really useful to help drive what we're doing. All right, so my takeaways, just very briefly, borealization in the Bering Sea, from what we can see, is not a linear or unidirectional process. It can be, it's the response times of individual species and the magnitudes of those responses will differ based on the different components of the fauna. And again, the engagement with the local native communities has been really critical to our success in this area, I think. For those who are interested in seeing our survey data or making survey data requests, I put a couple of QR codes here, one to our public-facing data set, which is called FOSS, the Fisheries One-Stop Shop, and then the other is to our basic data products interface. So probably don't have time for questions now, but there's my email, and I'd be happy to answer questions later and data requests.
Great. Thank you, Dwayne. And like before, see if anybody has like a question that can't wait. Otherwise, we'll switch over to Catherine. All right. Thank you. Catherine, are you ready to go?
Yeah, let's see if I can get this to work. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So this talk is primarily about a response to Lyle telling me the nutshell what Dwayne was going to be talking about and asked if we were seeing the same with marine mammals. And I think I can just do a one-line summary now and we can all just leave. It's same. Yeah, it's really cool to see your talk. I thought that was really interesting. So I'm going to primarily be talking about the years we had around that hot period in 2018 and 2019 that Libby and Dwayne were both talking about. And I'd like to just thank all the people that have helped to pull these data together, to collect them at sea and to analyze them. They're all listed there. And also Dave Strauss and Phyllis Stabino from PML that's helped with the ice data. And also Phyllis doesn't know she's an author of this, so don't tell her. Why is it not advancing? There we go. Okay, so just a quick highlight of what data I'll be talking about here. So we deploy long-term passive acoustic moorings throughout the U.S. Arctic in the Chukchi, Bering, and Beaufort Seas. These are passive acoustic, which means they're only listening. They're not transmitting any sound out into the environment. They're pretty heavy. One of these things weighs about 1,000 pounds, so we need cranes to deploy them. This is the map of where we've had all of our moorings deployed since 2007. The red ones are currently in the water. We analyze all of the data we pull in. Let me get rid of this little thing here. We look at things like it's a page in a book. We're glancing to see what species are on that page. We analyze for around 11 species of cetaceans, both baleen whales, toothed whales, and pinnipeds. We also note anthropogenic sounds like vessels and seismic air guns. These are all the folks that have analyzed the data in recent years. And then recently we have been reaching out to AI. It's still not ready for prime time on our very complicated data set, but we're using it to sort of get at some of the low-hanging fruit and getting the data out a little quicker. So I'm just going to get into what we're seeing with the data, starting with bowhead whales. What I've done here is arrange the rows of the data from basically north to south, and they're color coded with the location, the mooring locations over here, just to kind of give you a reference. And then I've highlighted those two really warm years in red, just to kind of give you a reference. If there is gray here, that means either the mooring wasn't deployed or we haven't analyzed it yet. We have data coming back here, but it's under review by the Navy, so we haven't gotten our hands on that to analyze it yet. The blue squiggly line on here is the percent ice concentration, so you can kind of look and just see each ice season. It goes from January of 2012 up through December of 2023. And then the black lines are the percent concentration of the species that is on the side. So this is bowhead whales. So one thing to note about bowhead whales is they're very they track very well with the ice concentration. So they're only really present when the ice is there, and as the ice gets smaller and smaller, their presence becomes less and less. This is the area in sort of the central south of St. Matt's, to put it in Dwayne's reference points, where they were decreasing down from 2012 to 2017 as it was warming up in the the southern Bering Sea shelf. During those really warm years, they were there and there wasn't any ice there. So they kind of bucked that trend a little bit. But after that really warm period, as it's starting to cool down a little bit more, they're trending more only there really when the ice is there. The second thing to note is up around the Bering Strait area, primarily in the Point Hope area, it's more pronounced. This is a species that comes down from the eastern Beaufort, Canadian Beaufort, migrates down and overwinters in the Bering Sea, and then in the spring moves back up into the eastern Canadian Beaufort. So in the earlier years, you could see them passing through as the ice is coming in, migrating south, and then they're coming back up before ice goes away in the spring in the leads. And this was kind of the trend. They were transiting through the Point Hope area for many, many years until it got to those warm years. And then they were just overwintering there the whole time. And our question was, are they going to continue to just overwinter there? But as you can see, as time goes on, they're becoming more transitory there. So I'm hoping to see what the 2023-24 data show on that as well. Walrus, unlike the bowhead whales, are very associated with the ice. So they're really not here in the southern Bering Sea when the ice isn't there. They track really well with that. I'm not really seeing, maybe if you squint a little bit, any kind of difference of them being present in those really warm years versus not. I think they're just very tied to the ice and just moving with that. Gray whales. So gray whales, the main, they when they're migrating, they're very close to the coast, so very few of our moorings are actually in their path. But they do migrate through the Bering Strait region to get up to the Arctic every year. They're a species that overwinters in Mexico and comes all the way back up to the northern, the Beaufort Sea for the summer to feed. So we saw quite a decrease in detections as the area started to warm up between 2012 and 2017. Very much so during those super warm years, to a point where they weren't even there in the Chirikov Basin south of the Bering Strait in the 2020-2021 years. However, we are now starting to see an increase in their detections since then as it's starting to cool down. That's in contrast to humpback whales, who really didn't show any kind of increase or decrease during that time. They were just there the entire time. The cooling, the warming up during 2018 and 2019 didn't affect them at all. Another thing about the humpback whales is that they're not present when the ice is there. So you can see all these ice seasons, there's just no calling detected in there at all. However, in the southern Bering Sea, you could see that they were there just all year round around M4, which is by the Pribilof Islands, in those years where ice just wasn't very prominent. The interesting thing about humpback whales is in that northern Bering area, sort of from St. Matt's up to M8, the DBO1 region, is during those two really warm years, their presence really decreased in all of those sites, becoming more common as things started to cool down after that heat wave. Fin whales also showed a little bit further south, but also showed that decrease during the heat wave. And then North Pacific right whales, this is a slightly different slide. This is from work Dana Wright has done, and I have her information on the next slide. So it's at slightly different sites, and they're still color-coded here. This is that 2018-2019 warm heat wave. What she found is that in those cooler years prior to 2013, the main concentration of detections of right whales were in the southern southern Bering Sea shelf. In this, geez, my cursor's not working. In this polygon here, this is the North Pacific right whale critical habitat. So they were really commonly found there. And as it started to heat up between 2012 and 2017, their detections increased going northward all the way up to the northern Bering Sea areas here. And they are detected out at M8 as well. So that's very common, and that has been seen with work with tagging as well. When it's a warm year in the Bering Sea, the right whales spread out more, probably going after the prey, is what Dana has found from her work with that as well. So this is her tech memo she's just published, and this includes data from 2012 to 2018. She's working on getting that into a peer-reviewed publication as well. And we are also working on getting the data from 2018 to 2023 in there for a follow-up paper as well. She is currently taking those data and creating a joint species distribution model for the Bering Sea along that 70-meter isobath from M2 to M8, including passive acoustic data, the data from zooplankton from AFSC, also forage fish data, because the forage fish eat the same species that the right whales do, so they can serve as a proxy for where right whales would be as well. So moving along, just have a few more slides on our higher frequency species. These are ones that we don't use AI for. So the amount of moorings that we've got included are less. So I've just kind of shrunk these down so you can see things better. So beluga whales are similar to bowhead whales in that they did show this migratory pattern prior to that heat wave. And during the heat wave, they stayed there all winter at, and I've got the wrong one circled here. This is the Point Hope area north of Bering Strait. Ribbon seals showed the most difference with the heat wave up off of Uktiavik, where they went from being kind of present right before the ice season until, and then they just had a decreased presence during the heat wave up there. Not really seeing much of a difference anywhere else. And then bearded seals, this is work that we are doing with AI, so we're able to get a lot of data. Like the walrus, they're very tied to the ice, so we're not really seeing much of a change with the heat wave other than they're just not there because the ice isn't there. And then I think this is finally killer whales. So this is work Bryn Kimber's done, and the paper just came out, I believe it was yesterday. Where in the Bering Strait region, there has been a slight decrease in the detections of killer whales, and that has been coupled with an increase of killer whales in the northern Beaufort along the North Slope. And their theory is that, I'll just flip slide here. This is their paper, that the Bering Strait is acting as a choke point with the ice. So on heavy ice years, it's holding them there longer before they can get up into the Arctic. And in light ice years, they're able to get through earlier, and they're actually able to get through, they show up 30 days earlier at the Bering Strait and 50 days earlier up in the North Slope. And the thought is that the Bering Strait acts as a choke point with that ice, and when it's not there, that barrier is removed, and they're allowed to distribute out into the North Slope, where they come into contact with a lot more of the Arctic species that have been able to avoid them in the past because there was ice. With that, I am done, and I guess we're all ready to take questions.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so I'm happy to open it up for questions for any of our speakers. Let's see. I see Jim. Well, it looks like you're muted again. It clicked off and now it's back on mute.
How about now?
Now I can hear you.
Yeah, I just throw in from the physical point of view. I back what Dwayne was saying that it's more important to look at the interannual yearly events rather than thinking in terms of decadal trends. We were really taking back in 2018 and 19, the storm track was way north with as well as the Aleutian low. This gave southerly winds, record minimum sea ice, and warm temperatures. But what I want to really emphasize is the last 5 years, we've gone back to normal ice conditions. And this year, we've got strong east winds and we're growing sea ice like crazy, and the storm tracks going into California. And so I think the take home is if you want to look at the underlying climate variability, you should not stop your analysis in 2020 or 21 and forget the next 4 or 5 years when things have gone back to previous normals.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think you just kind of hit on one of the reasons why we also wanted to have this discussion is that kind of, quote unquote, return to normalcy. We were really curious, like whether or not we were seeing the same response in the organisms, or whether we would see some sort of persistence in the north, or something based on when the cold pool broke down and the gate opened up. Is there any other questions or comments from the other marine ecosystems co-leads?
I've got one for Catherine. Catherine, when you gave your presentation, you didn't mention with those killer whales that were moving north what we know about whether they're fish eating or mammal eating, and what the implications may be at an ecosystem level, and how that jives with what Dwayne presented. Thanks.
Thanks, Danielle. Yes, those are transients. Bryn was able to identify them to that ecotype. So they are mammal eaters, and so the thought is before the baleen whales were able to kind of hide out in the ice where the killer whales would not go, and now they're kind of overlapping. So not fish eaters.
Thanks.
Leandra.
Hello, good morning. Congratulations, everyone, on such a cool data set that you guys showed us today. I wish we had more time. So thank you for all that work, and it's super interesting. I was curious along the ecosystem point of view that Jim mentioned. What are your hypotheses as you go forward? I guess that's more a question for the group that Libby is working with, in terms of the east-west component, when Silvana starts looking more into the variation of these boreal versus Arctic species. If I'm thinking, I'm asking this in terms of future commercial fisheries. So if perhaps you're going to see a divide on that community that is more towards the Russian side or more towards the eastern side, and where do you think the further data analysis might take you from what you have seen so far? Thank you.
Thanks, Leandra. Yeah, it's an excellent question. And Silvana Gonzalez's EOF analyses could detect any shifts in distribution east to west. So that will be very interesting. I'm trying to recall, I did see some preliminary results. I can't remember the specific spatial patterns. I do recall that two of the strongest drivers were the cold pool in the northern Bering Sea, big surprise, and sea ice in the Chukchi Sea. So to the extent that the distribution of those drivers has an east-west component, I wouldn't be surprised if we see that in the biology. But I don't know yet. So stay tuned.
Thank you.
So I'm not seeing any hands, so I'll ask one. Catherine, we've received a lot of comments from native village communities about seeing more sightings of like stellars and fur seals in the northern Bering Sea, and the idea that there may be, it's come out a number of times that they may be persisting longer into the winter than they have historically. Does that show up in your recordings? Are you seeing something that would validate that from your side?
We don't analyze for the presence of those two species. They make kind of grunty, generic sounds that are super hard to distinguish from each other. So we haven't gone into that hornet's nest of data to look for it.
Okay, mainly curious because you start using the term like boreal, those might be more boreal pinnipeds that are in the region. So I was just curious. And I guess a question for Dwayne. Given kind of the modeling and whatnot that everybody is trying to do right now, just to put you on the spot, do you feel like there's anything that you would look at right now as a sentinel species that we should be trying to monitor to best track for something like borealization or essentially movement extents in the Bering Sea region? I preface it by saying something like pollock, where we're looking, or Pacific cod, where we can see like 1,000-kilometer wild trends from one year to the next, seems like not a good species, but something that's along the lines of also the shorthorn sculpin, which are pretty resident, also doesn't really work.
Yeah, the smoking gun. What would the smoking gun be that we would see to say, all right, well, this is a boreal system now? I mean, if something like, if we started seeing Pacific hake or something like that in the Bering Sea on a regular basis, that would be one thing. But I think a more practical thing is that, we see some intrusion of Gulf species into the very southern, through Unimak Pass, right into the very southern part of Bering Sea. Southern rock sole is an example, butter sole is an example. And to me, that's the easier thing to track, is if we start seeing, those Gulf species really start spreading onto the Bering Sea shelf and start seeing those further north in the Bering Sea, and sort of pouring more through the Gulf into the Bering Sea, that will be, to me, will be a good indication that we're seeing a more longer term trend there. I'm trying to think of other examples, maybe more big skates in the Bering Sea or something like that as well. But those are species that we already see to some extent in the Bering Sea, but there's a really limited, area of stations right there near Unimak Pass where we currently see those. And I would expect, if we're really seeing sort of a long-term trend toward borealization, that we would see those species really start moving up into the Bering Sea in larger numbers and in more consistent populations.
Thanks, Dwayne. We're at time, and actually my last comment, it looks like Tony just put it in the chat for everyone, which is that if you have a topic you'd like to see the marine ecosystems or any other community of practice through IARPC present or talk about, she's got a form there where you can submit that, and we will try to be responsive. Thanks. Do you have anything else, Tony, before we end this webinar?
Nope, just that, like I mentioned, this meeting has been recorded and we usually upload those on Thursdays. So a link should go up tomorrow on the event page in the YouTube channel. Just if you have any colleagues, coworkers, anyone who couldn't make it today, there will be a link for sharing out what was discussed. But just wanted to thank everybody again for joining. Thank you, Libby, Dwayne, and Catherine, for your presentations. And Happy New Year, everyone. This is the first IARPC meeting of the new year. So glad you could be here with us for this.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to see you.
Thank you.
Wonderful
Great
talks.
Thanks all.